Picture this. It is dawn on October 7, 1571. Don Juan of Austria walks onto the deck of his flagship and gives an order that sounds suicidal. He tells his carpenters to take their saws and hack off the prow, the heavy bronze battering ram at the front of the ship. His admirals freeze. For 2,000 years, the ram has been the only way to sink an enemy galley. To cut it off is to disarm yourself before the first punch is thrown. But Don Juan isn't interested in sinking ships the old way. He wants to turn the entire bow into a firing platform for heavy artillery. He's betting his life and the fate of Europe that gunpowder is stronger than wood. This single desperate tactical gamble is the opening move of the Battle of Lepanto, the day the Mediterranean Sea would literally run red with blood. To understand the rage burning in the hearts of those Christian soldiers, we have to rewind 2 months. We have to travel 1,000 miles east to the fortress city of Famagusta on the island of Cyprus. For nearly a year, the Ottoman Empire had been trying to swallow Cyprus, the jewel of the Venetian maritime empire. The Ottoman war machine had steamrolled through the island until only one city remained standing, Famagusta. Inside the walls was a Venetian commander named Marcantonio Bragadin. He led a garrison of 6,000 men against an Ottoman siege force of over 100,000. For 11 months they held out. They ate donkeys, cats, and boiled shoe leather. The Ottoman commander, Lala Mustafa Pasha, lost nearly 50,000 men trying to take one crumbling city. By August 1571, the food was gone. The gunpowder was gone. Bragadin decided to surrender, but he negotiated an honorable treaty. The Ottomans agreed to let the survivors leave safely. On August 5th, Bragadin walked out in his finest red robes to hand over the keys. They drank sherbet and exchanged pleasantries. But then the atmosphere shifted, sudden and violent. Mustafa began accusing Bragadin of murdering prisoners. At a signal, Ottoman guards drew their swords. Bragadin's officers were hacked to pieces right in front of him. But for Bragadin, Mustafa had planned something far worse. They cut off his ears and his nose. They threw him into a dungeon. 2 weeks later, on August 17th, less than 2 months before Lepanto, Bragadin was dragged into the main square. He was forced to carry sacks of earth and kiss the ground. He was hoisted up on a ship's yardarm, dangling like a broken puppet for the army to mock. And then came the finale. They tied him to a column. An executioner stepped forward with a small knife and slowly, methodically, they flayed him alive. They started at his neck and peeled the skin from his body in a single piece. Bragadin reportedly died when the knife reached his waist, murmuring a prayer. But the horror didn't end with his death. They took his skin, stuffed it with straw, sewed it back together, dressed it in his uniform, mounted it on a cow, and paraded it through the streets. When the Ottoman fleet sailed home, Bragadin's stuffed skin was tied to the flagship's mast, a trophy swinging in the wind. News of this atrocity traveled fast. It reached Venice, then Rome, then Madrid. It did something that decades of diplomacy had failed to do. It unified the West. When the soldiers at Lepanto looked across the water at the Ottoman ships, they weren't just seeing an enemy navy. They were imagining Bragadin. They knew there would be no quarter given today, no civilized surrender. If they lost, they wouldn't just be prisoners, they would be meat. The impossible alliance. While Bragadin was being flayed alive, a different kind of torture was taking place in Rome, the torture of diplomacy. Pope Pius V was 67 years old, dying of kidney stones, often screaming in pain during meetings. But he was possessed by a single burning obsession. He had to stop the Ottoman advance. The problem was, the only powers that could stand up to the Sultan, Spain and Venice, hated each other. Venice were the capitalists of the Renaissance. They didn't care about crusades, they cared about profit. For centuries, they'd been the Ottomans' best trading partner. They only wanted to fight now because the Sultan was stealing their property, Cyprus. Spain, led by King Philip II, was the exact opposite. Slow, pious, obsessively cautious. Philip viewed the Venetians as treacherous, greedy shopkeepers. He didn't care about Cyprus. He was worried about Barbary pirates raiding Spanish villages. For nearly a year, negotiations dragged on. Venice screamed, "We must sail east to save Cyprus." Spain said, "No, we must sail south to secure Tunis." While they argued, the Ottoman fleet grew stronger. But Pope Pius V was relentless. He used guilt, shame, threats of excommunication. He essentially locked them in a room and refused to let them leave until they signed a deal. Finally, on May 25, 1571, the impossible happened. The treaty was signed. The Holy League was officially born, the largest Christian coalition since the Crusades. But a fleet this size needed a commander. A Venetian admiral would never take orders from a Spaniard. The Pope needed a compromise, someone with royal blood, someone with charisma, someone technically Spanish but not too political. He found his answer in a 24-year-old, Don Juan of Austria. When Don Juan walked into the port of Messina in Sicily, he looked like he'd stepped out of a romance novel. He was 24 years old with flowing blonde hair, dressed in flashy velvet and gold. He kept a pet lion cub in his cabin. To the hardened, gray-bearded admirals, he must have looked like a joke. But they underestimated him. Don Juan wasn't born a prince. He was born in secret to a washerwoman in Germany. His father was Holy Roman Emperor Charles V. For years, the boy was raised as a peasant, completely unaware of his true identity. He was a royal bastard with the blood of emperors but no kingdom. This distinction defined his psychology. If he wanted a crown, he couldn't inherit it. He had to conquer it. He was a man starving for glory. When he arrived in Messina, he didn't act like a distant overlord. He walked the docks, visited the sick bays, broke up fights between Venetians and Spaniards personally. He managed to charm the egos of men 3 times his age. But his most important contribution wasn't just diplomacy, it was aggression. The Council of War was filled with cautious old men advising to preserve the fleet, avoid battle. Don Juan slammed his fist on the table and famously said, "Gentlemen, the time for council has passed. The time for fighting has come." He ordered the fleet to sail east, hunting for the Ottomans. He wasn't looking to patrol, he was looking for a knockout blow. But courage alone doesn't sink ships. Don Juan was relying on a terrifying new evolution in naval technology. The Venetians had brought 6 strange, lumbering beasts called galleasses. A galleass was a hybrid monster, built on the hull of a massive merchant ship but fitted with oars. It was much higher, wider, and heavier than a standard galley. Because they were so high out of the water, soldiers on normal galleys couldn't board them. But the real game-changer was the firepower. A standard galley only had cannons at the front. The galleass was packed with artillery along its sides. It could fire in a 360-degree arc. The Venetians positioned these 6 giants at the front of the battle line, about a mile ahead of the main fleet. They looked like slow, clumsy sitting ducks. The Ottoman commanders likely dismissed them as supply ships. Ali Pasha, the Ottoman admiral, made the fatal mistake of ignoring them. He ordered his fleet to row past them to get to the real fight. He didn't realize he was sailing directly into a kill zone. What was coming over the horizon was a death sentence. To the east, the Ottoman fleet was already in formation. Nearly 300 ships arranged in a perfect, suffocating crescent moon that stretched 4 miles from tip to tip, driven by the muscles of tens of thousands of Christian slaves chained below deck. Facing them was the Holy League, a chaotic patchwork of rivals jammed together in a line that looked ready to break. They were outnumbered, tired, and terrified. Don Juan's order to cut the rams rippled down the line. Other captains hesitated, then followed. The heavy bronze beaks splashed into the water. The guns at the bow could now aim straight at the waterline of incoming enemies. The wind suddenly shifted, dropping to dead calm. The sails went limp. Now it was all down to muscle. The fleets accelerated toward each other. The Christian versus Muslim conflict about to reach its violent climax in a head-on collision of 500 ships. For most of the morning, a strong wind had been pushing the Ottoman fleet forward, blowing dust into Christian eyes. It seemed like God had picked a winner. But then as the fleets closed, the wind suddenly died. The Ottoman sails went limp. Their momentum stalled. Then the breeze picked up again from the west, filling the sails of the Holy League. To superstitious 16th-century sailors, this wasn't meteorology. It was a sign. At noon, as the Ottoman center surged forward, they approached those 6 Venetian fortresses. Ali Pasha made a split-second decision. He signaled his ships to split formation and row around the galleasses, treating them like rocks in a stream. It was the worst mistake of his life. As the Ottoman galleys exposed their broadsides, the sides of the galleasses erupted. This wasn't a single pop, it was rolling thunder. Cannonballs the size of bowling balls smashed into crowded decks. Splinters of wood, some as long as spears, flew through the air, impaling men in rows. One observer wrote that a single shot cleared a highway of death through an Ottoman ship's deck, taking off heads and limbs like a scythe through wheat. The perfect Ottoman formation disintegrated. Ships swerved, crashing into each other. The rhythm of the oarsmen was broken. Before the main fleets even touched, the Ottomans had lost a third of their momentum and plunged into chaos. Don Juan, watching from his flagship, drew his sword. The trap had worked. He ordered the trumpets to sound general attack. When the 2 main lines finally collided, the sound was described as the cracking of the world. Hundreds of wooden prows smashed into each other. The ships didn't just bump, they locked together. Grappling hooks were thrown. In an instant, the Mediterranean disappeared, replaced by a floating wooden continent miles long and drenched in smoke. Naval strategy ended. Butchery began. In the center, Don Juan's flagship and Ali Pasha's Sultana hunted each other. When they collided, the force was so great that the beak of the Sultana punched through to the fourth rowing bench. The two ships were locked together, inseparable. This wasn't a duel between ships, it was a duel between empires. On the Ottoman side were the Janissaries, the Sultan's elite shock troops. On the Spanish side were the tercios, the feared Spanish infantry in steel armor with heavy muskets. For over an hour, the deck became a meat grinder. Twice the Spanish pushed forward. Twice the Janissaries pushed them back. The deck was so slippery with blood that men had to sprinkle sand just to keep their footing. Both commanders had support galleys docked at their sterns. As soon as a soldier fell, a fresh one would climb up and jump into the fray. It was a continuous conveyor belt of death. Don Juan was in the thick of it, wounded in the foot but refusing to retreat, sword in hand. Ali Pasha was firing arrows from his composite bow, directing his defense even as bodyguards fell around him. But the tide was turning. The heavy Spanish muskets were doing their grisly work. Finally, a third Spanish assault broke the deadlock. They stormed the poop deck. Ali Pasha, surrounded and exhausted, reached for his sword, but a musket ball struck him in the head. What happened next was medieval in its brutality. A Spanish soldier hacked off Ali Pasha's head and jammed it onto a pike. It was hoisted high above the smoke, visible to every ship in the center. The effect was instantaneous. When Ottoman sailors saw their commander's head rotting on a Spanish pike, their spirit broke. The holy banner of the caliphate was torn down. In its place, the banner of the Holy League was raised. A wail of despair went up from the Turkish fleet. The invincibility of the Ottoman Empire had just been decapitated. The disciplined formation collapsed into panicked rout. Among the thousands fighting that day was a 24-year-old Spaniard on a galley called the Marquesa. His name was Miguel de Cervantes. Yes, the same man who would write Don Quixote, the most famous novel in history. But on October 7, 1571, he was nobody, just another sick soldier shivering with malaria. When the battle drums began, his captain ordered him to stay below deck. He was too weak to stand. But Cervantes refused. "I would rather die fighting for God and my king than preserve my life in the hull." He dragged himself onto deck and fought for hours. The cost was high. Cervantes was shot 3 times. 2 musket balls slammed into his chest, stopped by his armor. But the third tore through his left hand, shattering bones and severing nerves. It hung useless by his side for the rest of his life. Years later, he wrote about that day with soaring pride, calling his mangled hand a withered limb that raised the glory of the right. He said he would rather have been wounded there than safe and whole and have missed the greatest occasion that past or present ages have seen. As the smoke cleared on October 8, the survivors understood the cost. The waters were so choked with wreckage and bodies that in some places you couldn't see the sea. In just 4 hours, roughly 40,000 men had died, more than double the number killed at Waterloo, condensed into a single afternoon. It remains the bloodiest day in the entire history of naval warfare. The Holy League had captured or sunk nearly 200 Ottoman ships. But the most human statistic wasn't the dead, it was the living. On captured Ottoman galleys, the victors found over 12,000 Christian slaves chained to rowing benches. In an instant their chains were struck off. It was the largest single liberation event in history up to that point. But did Lepanto actually change anything? Cynical historians point out that the Holy League fell apart almost immediately. Within 6 months, the Ottomans had rebuilt their entire fleet. The Grand Vizier famously told the Venetian ambassador, "By conquering Cyprus, we cut off one of your arms. At Lepanto you only shaved our beard." An arm cannot grow again, but a shaved beard grows back all the better for the razor. On paper he was right. But in the soul of the world he was wrong. Lepanto didn't destroy the Ottoman Empire, but it broke their spell. For a century Europe believed the Turks were invincible. Lepanto proved they were just men. They could bleed, they could panic, and they could die. After 1571, the Ottomans never again seriously threatened the Western Mediterranean. The expansion stopped. The psychological tide had turned. So when we look back at Lepanto, we shouldn't just see a clash of religions. We should see the final violent crescendo of the ancient world. A day when the sea turned red, a young prince gambled everything on a sword and gunpowder strategy, and a writer named Cervantes lost a hand to give the world a story.